Welcome, 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 everyone. An absolute pleasure to see everyone out here today. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming out and joining the live stream. I always love the live streams. I love everyone asking questions and getting to engage in the comment section. So welcome, 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 everyone. And of course, in case you're wondering when we stream, it's always Monday, 2 p.m. New Zealand time. For a lot of you, that'll be Sunday night in North America, or the middle of the night if you're in Europe. So my hat's off to everyone over in Europe who's staying up super late and watching a crypto live stream. Your dedication is awesome, guys, without a doubt. Now, today we're going to be talking about the topic of Hyperbitcoinization, which is very exciting. Looking at the ideas behind Bitcoin becoming the global currency and some of the catalysts that might be needed for that to happen, not to mention some of the real world use cases that are really, really massive that are already developing for cryptocurrencies. So we're going to get into all that. And of course, I got a special announcement for you today. All coins are going to the moon. So anybody who asks me about any random cryptocurrency, it's going to the moon. No, I'm just teasing with you guys. Always, of course, happy to answer any questions that I can. So feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Hopefully I can get to quite a few of those today. You guys know I really, really appreciate those questions, so make sure you guys bring those to the table. Now, the markets have been doing nice the past couple of days, which is always very, very encouraging. Obviously, though, we are so far from being out of the woods, especially for anybody who was buying back in January or December. And I want to tell you a little bit about a new project that I've been working on with some other really, really great people on YouTube. So we've actually been working on something we're going to be calling the Token Tank. So this is a collaboration between me and a couple other crypto YouTubers. So we're going to be bringing some of the hottest ICO projects to you guys and just bringing in the grill time in terms of bringing really great interviews with these projects for you guys to get the best information. So watch out for that to come. I'll be publishing our first episode tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that coming in. Crypto Numbnuts asking about the I Am Satoshi videos. It'll come one of these days. It'll just be a little surprise that'll pop out of the woodwork there. I'm trying to leave it long enough so that everyone kind of forgets that it happened. And then bam! I Am Satoshi video. It's coming. It's coming. You'll see it one of these days for sure. Now, the idea of hyper-Bitcoinization is a very, very fascinating idea. And in case you haven't had a chance to check into it yet, it's the idea that essentially someday Bitcoin could be the global currency. Peter J. asking, Lark, how are your training videos coming? It is a much bigger task than I initially thought it was going to be. Currently, I've made about 55 different videos. Some of them actually need to be re-recorded, so it's a big mission, especially considering I'm trying to always get out those, 5 news videos a week and a live stream and reviews and interviews and all that stuff, but it's coming. It's coming. It will definitely be out, and I've been having a lot of fun actually putting it together, but it is a big, big thing without a doubt. And of course, we're trying to get a website launched at the same time with it. So stay tuned. It's coming. We're working on it. Peter Gallagher, please do your Sean Connery impression. I must ask you a question. Oh, goodness. Anyway, hyper-Bitcoinization. The idea is fascinating that if essentially Bitcoin were able to become the global currency, it would be worth like, $100 million of Bitcoin or something like that. I don't know if we'll actually get to that point, but the concept is certainly interesting. And obviously we'll probably be in a place more between massive amounts of Bitcoin utilization mixed in with local currencies and other cryptocurrencies as well. That's one thing that hyper-Bitcoinization does kind of miss out on, that there are so many other cryptocurrencies filling unique and interesting niches that it won't just be Bitcoin. And in fact, if Bitcoin were to get to such a level with the loss of Bitcoin over time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you might even see some kind of future situation where one Satoshi is like having a unit of silver or something like that, or a gram of gold might be that kind of an equivalent, which would be very, very interesting. But that's quite a ways off. Skyfreak app asks, what happened with the cool shirts? Skyfreak, we gave those away in the Friday news video the other day. So I can't remember who it was, but somebody did win those over on Twitter. So the shirts are out. We've got a few more actually hanging around here. So there will be more giveaways coming up without a doubt. So do keep an eye out for those coming. Now, when you look at the concept behind hyperbitcoinization, is a voluntary transition from an inferior currency to a superior one. Its adoption is a series of individual acts of entrepreneurship rather than a single monopolist that games the system. Because essentially that's where we are right now. We have people are geofenced in largely with corrupt governments that can't really manage finance all that well. And when you look at that, national currencies, many of them haven't performed super awesomely. I know there's a very large Forex market and they do well versus each other, but over time, purchasing power parity has gone down for most major global currencies, which is incredibly alarming to anyone whose wages have been stagnating over that time. You can look across a range of countries and see wage stagnation coupled together with hyperinflation or massive inflation of the local currencies. The US dollar obviously is a prime example of this, having lost a huge percentage of its total value ever since it got off of the gold standard quite a ways back in the past. But where do we go from here? See, Bitcoin has the amazing fact that it is actually a deflationary currency over time, that there will indeed be less and less and less of it available. Very keen. How about 1 sat equals 1 cent? That's more real. Hard to say where we'll get. The one tricky part of the picture with trying to imagine a future scenario in which Bitcoin was the ubiquitous global currency is how much Bitcoin will have been lost up to that point. Because we've already lost about, I think, 20% of Bitcoin may never be found again, if we're, of course, assuming that Satoshi's stash will never indeed be used by Elon Musk to go to Mars. Elon Satoshi, guys. It's Elon. I know it is. I know it. Let it be Elon. Of course, we'll see if that ever gets moved in the future. And people continue to lose it all the time. People are constantly losing their private keys. And this is a real problem, that the total amount of Bitcoin will go down over time, which is interesting. Not to mention, of course, that it is on a deflationary emission rate. That's a different part of the story, but an interesting part of the story nevertheless. Justin, Ohio, have you talked about Hashflare yet? I have not talked about Hashflare yet. I was actually going to talk about it more in my news video tomorrow, but I'll just give a quick update on that for anyone who doesn't know. Hashflare has canceled the Bitcoin mining contracts as per the terms of the contract that everyone entered into when they did get a Hashflare contract over there. Really unfortunate situation. Obviously, a lot of people, including myself, have been screwed by that situation. It's interesting that Hashflare did go this route, considering that other providers like Genesis Mining have been able to continue payouts, but it's unfortunate. Hashflare was always a so-so company. It was always the secondary to Genesis Mining, and obviously, look, cloud mining is potentially profitable, and there were times when it definitely did have profitability. If you got a cloud mining contract this time last year, you've probably done okay, but going into any new cloud mining contracts now is highly problematic. We can see, for example, the price that has gone with the new Genesis mining contracts is absolutely crazy, considering you could get out there and just buy so much more Bitcoin on the market today than you'd ever possibly make from that. The numbers don't even look good going into it. Whereas last year, if you got some cloud mining contracts, the numbers were at least going into it. You might get more Bitcoin in the end. It was something that I had a small percentage of my portfolio into. I know that there are a lot of people who really over invested into that. And it's a rough lesson, and it's unfortunate that Hashflare did go this way, but that is indeed what happened. But I'll give some more comments on it tomorrow in my news video as well. I want to continue on the idea of hyper-Bitcoinization here for you. So a few things that are going to be the driving force behind hyper-Bitcoinization are the general awesomeness factors of Bitcoin itself. So we see, for example, there is no border control for Bitcoin. That's actually really, really big. Has anyone out there ever tried to send an international money transfer? I remember one of the first times that I was doing this, and I was in Hawaii, I was in Maui, and I was trying to send money to New Zealand. And I went into the bank and I said, well, I need to send money to New Zealand. And I just got this look back from the bank tellers, just like I'm some alien creature that's walked in. They had no idea what I was talking about. Like, okay, they knew where New Zealand was, but just couldn't understand. Like, you want to send like money to New Zealand through us, like the bank? Like, yeah, you guys do that, right? That in of itself is problematic, that we have a lot of people working in the banking industry that don't really get this. But much, much, much more importantly is what they call the feudal monetary system. And that is really what we see happening right now with the global monetary system. We have a situation where people are trapped into their local currencies that are run by corrupt or inept or even worse, malicious governments that want to keep their populations down, on the far end of the suspicion scale, I suppose. But realistically, if you are someone who lives in Myanmar or let's say Venezuela, right? Venezuela is something we are going to talk about today, but you're trapped. You can't get something like dollars or euros because of government capital control over the bank, simply not having them available. And nobody wants your currency. And that is incredibly problematic. You go to the bank, you can't get any hard currency out, hard currency like US dollar or euros or pounds. You can't get that. You can't access that as a normal citizen. And even if you could, you probably can't send an international money transfer because there might be sanctions on your country. The US, for example, has sanctions on Venezuela, which makes it very hard for anyone to do anything. But with the power of Bitcoin, we can see all of those controls by governments undone. And this is very, very compelling for a lot of people around the world. I know that a lot of people watching this stream right now might not feel that kind of pinch. We probably all live in nice countries where it's relatively easy to send an international money transfer. Still takes 3 to 5 days and all the rest of the drama that goes with it. But to have the ability to not have to go to a middleman, to just go log into your Bitcoin wallet and send Bitcoin, that is where the real power is. The fact that you have taken away this centralized authority. You do not need anyone's permission to have a Bitcoin wallet. And that's massive. That's really, really massive. And again, I know that a lot of us live in this state of relative global privilege, even if you don't feel like it. If you have a bank account, you're already in the top tier in terms of privilege. And it's not about banking and all this stuff is, yeah, okay, screw banking. I know banks suck. But the reality is that the ability to access banking services, whether through a centralized bank or the future decentralized systems of finance, and this is what it really comes down to, systems of finance. Can you access those financial tools? Traditionally, of course, again, we see it all having to be done through banks. They're the middlemen. They take your money, give you almost nothing back for it, and charge the other guy that walks through the door 30% to borrow that money. That's a broken system. Not to mention, of course, government inflation policies. This is got to be one of the worst things. People work harder and harder and harder, and the wages don't necessarily go up to meet the way the markets are moving, and of course to keep with inflation. So inflation goes up, your wages stagnate, your ability to buy things at the end of the day becomes less and less. Now, one thing that gets often touted with Bitcoin, except for obviously the thing of, well, it's only used by criminals for buying drugs and money laundering and all that stuff. And well, hey, yeah, Bitcoin is used for buying drugs. And depending on where you fall on the drug debate anyway, personally, I think that cannabis should definitely be legal, and perhaps some of the more nefarious drugs at least be decriminalized, because that's a whole crazy situation. But nevertheless, if you think that drugs are the key evil in the world and should be banned, well, then let's blame the dollar. Let's blame the euro, because that's what the real currency of international drug trade is. But people are always saying you can't really buy anything with it. Well, that is changing every single day. This is a pretty encouraging story coming out of the Baltic states in Europe. Samsung accepts cryptocurrency payments in 3 different Baltic states. That's pretty cool. That's actually pretty cool. So it's not just that you can pay for things in their shop, but they actually accept a few different cryptocurrencies as well. Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP, Litecoin, Dash, NUM, and Steam. That's really awesome. That gives a real world use case for it. You can actually go out, go over on Steam it, post your blog posts, then you earn a little bit of Steam, you go down, you buy yourself a new phone. That is awesome. That gives use cases when you can actually easily get your hands on this. Vikrant says, why should you pay in Bitcoin? That's a good question, Vikrant. Now, look, obviously there is a lot of benefits for the merchant. There's no chargeback, and there's, of course, no credit card fees. But as a regular user, well, it starts to be a bit of a trickier situation, because if you're buying your Bitcoin with fiat and then going down to pay for a coffee, you might be better off paying in fiat in that given situation. But if you are trying to buy something from overseas, and again, this is a situation where a lot of people living in privileged countries and privileged situations may not see the utility in it, but if you live in Venezuela, Bitcoin has become a lifeline for you. It is a necessity for paying in things because your own currency is worth nothing. It's very, very important for those people to be able to do that. Now, one thing that is interesting is that merchants could actually be offering discounts for paying in cryptocurrencies, and that would actually incentivize people to then be paying in Bitcoin. And more people are actually earning money in cryptocurrencies. This story out of Costa Rica. Costa Rican workers can legally be paid in cryptocurrency. And I've asked this question to a lot of you before. Would you like to be paid in cryptocurrencies? And a lot of people say, yeah, I would love to be paid in cryptocurrencies. Maybe not all of my wages, but certainly a part of it. And that is where it becomes interesting. Or certainly if you buy Bitcoin today for $7,500 and then it goes up to $20,000, well, sure, you could go out and do the exchange back and pay a few percentage, some percentage points in cashing your money out, or you could just go buy something with that if you have merchants that accept Bitcoin. So there's a lot of advantages to paying for it. And if merchants are allowed to actually offer discounts. Now, in the United States, if you accept American Express, you're not allowed to offer discounts. The Supreme Court has actually ruled in the favor of American Express in their non-competitive contracts that they offer. But that being said, the situation is developing every day, and the United States is not the epicenter of the universe. There are a lot of other countries out there that are doing really great things and really great innovations in cryptocurrencies. Costa Rican workers being paid in crypto, that's awesome. It's becoming more normal in Japan. I know a lot of people who work for different cryptocurrency companies, and they actually receive their wages in cryptocurrency. I was talking to Brad from Dash, and he gets paid in Dash. He lives in Australia. He works with a service that he can actually pay his bills in cryptocurrency. So again, it's about the kind of currency that you receive. If you are paid in euros, well, maybe no one accepts euros where you live, but you're paid in euros. And that becomes an interesting situation. So you might say, well, why wouldn't you just pay in euros? Because no one takes euros. But if you live in a place where, hey, people actually do accept these currencies, then you can use them. And it's happening more and more. More and more people are paying in cryptocurrencies. More and more people are accepting cryptocurrencies, which is very, very interesting. One use case that gets often brought out is that, well, I can use cryptocurrencies to hide my money and it's great for privacy. Well, some of them are. Zcash is great for privacy, for example, but Bitcoin is not so much. And actually, even though we frequently see certain lawmakers come out and say, you see, it was the Bitcoin again, they did the drugs or the money laundering and all this stuff. Well, how'd you find that out? Because it's a frickin' public ledger, that's why. That is problematic in of itself. Bitcoin is a public ledger. It is relatively easy to find out who has the Bitcoin. Certainly, if you do enough looking, you have enough investigative skills and access to the right accounts, you can definitely find that out. The freedom thing may be one of the bigger motivating factors for me when it comes down to cryptocurrencies. The fact that you do not need the bank, you do not need that middleman in order to tell you that you're allowed to pay someone. Think about that. Remember, WikiLeaks, for example, had to start accepting Bitcoin because the international payment providers cut them off. They censored them. That is something you have to think about. Again, you have to ask Visa and MasterCard's permission in order to be able to buy something. Now, usually they're quite happy to give you that permission because when it comes down to it, they get money off of that. Especially when you're buying something like some vegetables or the new Cardi B album or whatever. Yeah, that's fine. You can buy that. Oh, you want to donate to WikiLeaks? Screw you, man. You're not allowed to give that person money. And that is where the problem comes in. You have someone who's telling you no. When you use a bank, you have to play by their rules, and their rules are all in their favor. And that's a bad game to play. Just imagine if you went to go and play Monopoly, right? And one guy just took all the money and said, "Hey, welcome to Monopoly. Would you like to do anything in the Monopoly world? Well, go and work for me, then I'll give you a little bit of money." It's a crazy system, and it's a system that is moving in the direction of decentralization. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are critical of that and say, well, big companies are going to adopt this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is going to be a mass tokenization happening over the next few years where we see big companies bring out their own tokens, probably their own proprietary tokens, but they might have access to public decentralized networks. That is an important part of the equation. But definitely, we will see that movement towards more and more cryptocurrencies being used because there's a lot of advantages in payments for crypto. Be your own bank, says Latigo66. Amen to that. Third Man Crypto brings up another great point. Would you like to buy cryptocurrencies? Well, you know what most credit card companies say is either no. My brother's bank is like that. It just straight up tells them, no, you are not allowed to buy cryptocurrencies. If you want to go down the street to the casino, nice, no problem. You can overdraw your account all you want. You want to go down to the strip club? Great. You want to go down to the local corner store and buy so much vodka you can kill yourself? No problem. You want to buy a Bitcoin? Whoa, we got to protect you from that. That could be dangerous. Ay, ay, ay. And again, I do want to point out that if you are here now listening to this conversation, we live in a state of privilege already. And a lot of the examples that I've given you are the ways in which we might be cut out. And there's some niches. Yeah, okay, I can't donate to WikiLeaks, or certain banks won't let you buy cryptocurrencies, for example. But relatively, if you live in somewhere like the United States or the UK or Australia or New Zealand or a lot of other countries, if you have access to watch this stream right now and you're a cryptocurrency investor, chances are that the real use cases, while very interesting for us as speculators, there are other people who can benefit even more from this technology. And I know that a lot of attention gets given to the and underbanked populations of the world. And here's a great map for you showing the amount of and underbanked people around the world. It's actually shocking to see how many people don't have access to regular financial services. And again, we can sit here and criticize banks all day long, but the reality is that being able to save your money in a place, that's powerful. Being able to ask for a loan in order to help your business grow, that is powerful. So that is really, really important to consider here, is that there are all these people who are largely, you look at a lot of these countries, many of these people are geofenced. They are stuck. The international system looks at them as non-people, basically. If you're in some of these developing economies, it's very difficult for you to even leave your country because of the visa regime that is post-colonial and all the rest of the BS. But a lot of those people, there are no local banking services. You're stuck on a local currency, which is virtually worthless half the time. And that becomes incredibly problematic. And it's not just the developing world. And I think this is something really, really interesting to point out. 1 in 4 Americans is underbanked. Now that's just the underbanked amount. The actual unbanked population in the United States is 7%. Just think about that. That is the richest country in the world. 7% of the population is unbanked. And I know, there are certain people who are simply not going to want to have bank accounts. I get that, but that's not 7% of the country. It isn't. And you look across a lot of the other people, the underbanked people, that is where the real tricks start to come in, because we have a lot of people who are going to payday lenders, who are going to check cashing stores, using prepaid debit cards and all of this BS, and they're getting charged fees and fees and fees and fees and fees every single time that happens. That is a problem, because the poorest people in the world are having to pay the most to access these financial systems. User Pike says, my friend Calvin won't get a bank account. I've tried to get him into crypto and he doesn't trust it either. Well, maybe he'll eventually realize that the things he doesn't like about banking don't really exist in Bitcoin, because there is no central authority controlling it all. Project Ziptide said they all need cell phones first. Yes, I agree. They do need cell phones, but we are seeing a situation right now where cell phone ownership is absolutely exploding globally. There are a lot of villages, for example, across the African continent, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia. They may not have electricity lines running into the village, but they might have a few solar panels, and that is enough. That is enough to be able to charge your mobile phone. And mobile phone prices have come down so substantially. Yeah, okay, you can go out and buy a new Apple, what are we up to now, number 10 or something like that? Well, that's great. That's great. But for a lot of people, that is more money than they'll make in years. However, you can get phones for like $20 or $30 in a lot of these markets. It's a very, very simple smartphone, but it's got internet connectivity, and that is important. That is how people are going to get mainstream access to cryptocurrencies. Because imagine, you're living in this tiny village. There's no bank in your village. There's very little currency. Actually, what Bancor did recently in Kenya is super interesting, because they came out and essentially created tokens and put it down to a situation where they brought life back into these local economies that hadn't really had it before, because the fiat currency simply isn't there, and it makes the exchange difficult. But it's happening. For anyone who doesn't think it's happening already. We've covered a lot of stories on the channel about different cryptocurrency projects, for example, operating in small villages, and really a lot of these are like pilot cases when it comes down to it. But in the next few years, we will see adoption continuing to move forward. We've already seen a situation of international remittances really taking the forefront here, because you can see here, this is the map of remittance flow. This is only in 2016. It's actually gone up since then. But you can see how much money is flowing globally. Right now, the average percentage is around 7.5%. 7.5%. A few $100 billion annually is flowing around the world in the form of international remittances, and these guys are getting 7.5%. That is obscene beyond belief. Again, while Bitcoin may not be the most practical thing to go down the street and pay for your coffee with, if you are a Kazakhstani worker in Moscow and you want to send money back home, Bitcoin's a great option. If you are a Filipino worker in Saudi Arabia and want to send money back home, Bitcoin is a great option. In fact, there are even better options than Bitcoin. There are other cryptocurrencies that move faster than Bitcoin. Use Dash, for example, or you can use Litecoin, or a whole host of other cryptocurrencies that can actually do that. Obviously, when we see the Lightning Network coming on board, that'll really help small payments happen in a massive place around the world. And that is really, really cool. But we'll also see remittance prices dropping for things like Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is currently the most liquid cryptocurrency. And that is important, because if you're sending money over to back home to the Philippines, let's say, you have to know that when that Bitcoin gets there, it's easy to cash out into local currency. Or obviously, hopefully we get to that point where you don't have to cash it out. You can just go down the street and buy your bananas with it, or whatever you might be purchasing. That will be a different situation when it comes to that. Okay, on to our next bit. International sanctions. Trigger alert! Trigger alert! Now, this is actually a really interesting use case for me, because I know that there are a lot of people out there who take Iran and assume that Iran is a bad guy. And that by default, because they disagree with the politics of the Iranian government, that all the people in Iran also need to suffer. Because that's essentially what sanctions do. And this is a pretty provocative picture here of a bunch of people, looks like in front of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, burning some flags. There's like 20 people there. Who knows what this picture is about, who took it, where it's from, when it was taken. Always question the source, without a doubt. But the reality is that there is a sanctions regime against certain countries, and those countries are cut off from the networks of international finance. And that is incredibly problematic for these countries because it is such an important part of international finance to be able to access things like loans from big banks. Countries get loans. And in fact, I covered a story recently where the United States has told a German bank to freeze 300 million euros of Iran's money. Just think about that. I actually had somebody comment something like, well, Iran is a terrorist state and they deserve to have their money frozen and all these things. And hey, look, we're not trying to get into the politics of it here. If you think that Iran is a terrorist state, that is your opinion, but definitely look into the facts and don't just believe what you're being told on the media. That is an important thing to keep in mind. And you do have to make sure that you separate governments from the people. Sterling says, my neighbors are from Iran. I don't buy the hate Iran narrative. One country benefits from Iran hate. Amen to that. Amen to that. And you have to look, how many places has Iran invaded in the past 20 years? This is a tricky situation politically, but the unfairness of a situation where one country can look at another country who they politically disagree with and say, you're frozen. Your international bank accounts are frozen. You're cut off from international finance. You're cut off from the international banking system. And if you try to work with anyone, we're going to put pressure on to make sure they're cut off too. In fact, Societe Generale was fined, I think it was 10 billion euros. That might be the wrong number, but they were fined an obscene amount of money because they dealt with Iranian banks. That is a problem when you have countries doing this. And if you try to examine the political situation, it's pot calling the kettle black. It's really just political games. And that is what it comes down to. However, if Iran had had that $300 million euros, sitting in Bitcoin, that would have never been able to happen. So there you go. And this situation continues to a lot of other countries. And again, I know there's a situation where a lot of people look at Russia, for example, and think that Russia is some kind of international villain, that they're the bad guys who run around doing bad things all the time. And again, if you look into the facts behind it, this is not really what's happening. All the governments are playing these kind of games where they meddle in each other's elections. I mean, in 2016, I think it was also, was it Saudi Arabia? The Gulf states were also meddling in the U.S. election, and also Ukrainian oligarchs were trying to meddle in the U.S. election, but the only one who gets blamed, of course, is Russia at the end of the day. In fact, they have more sanctions put on them for not really doing much very different. And again, you can decide where you want to fall politically on these issues. But when it comes to finance, this is an incredibly important thing because Russia, ever since the sanctions regime against Russia has started, has had a real problem with their economy. Again, this is a country of 150 million people, and a small group of countries who control the finance of the world largely have decided that these are the bad guys. And who suffers? Because I'm telling you, it's not the big guys who suffer. The oligarchs in Russia, they are well spread out into euros and dollars and gold and property and all the rest of it. No, it's regular people. That's who always suffers. And so supporting sanctions regimes against countries only makes the people suffer, and usually in a situation when they can't really change the government anyway, it's cruel and unusual. And look, Russia is not in the same situation that Iran is in terms of sanctions. The sanctions against Russia have been quite mild in terms of certain oligarchs have been sanctioned, for example. But nevertheless, this is a situation where people need options. People need to have these currencies that don't have any borders. They need to have currencies that people can use anywhere. You don't need the permission of a bank. You don't need the permission of the United States. The fact that countries have to go and beg America to be allowed to use the international banking system, that's a broken system. That's a system that doesn't work anymore. That's a system that cannot continue into the future because it's all based on cheap politics. And cheap politics is not going to move us forward as a society. It's only going to divide us more, and that is where a lot of the problems come in. And of course, the funny thing is, I don't know how the US is calling the shots when it comes to finance anyway. Could you imagine if your friend had $21 trillion in debt and then asked for another $1 trillion every year? Because that's basically what's happening with the United States right now. $21 trillion in debt. They're the most indebted country in the world, and they're calling the shots. They're the ones who are saying who can and cannot access international finance. The great irony is who keeps lending America money? Well, I know they keep printing the money themselves, but somebody still has to buy those bonds. Now, one other thing that could lead, where am I going with all this? Another thing that could lead to hyperbitcoinization is actually the decline of the US dollar. Now, currently, the US dollar is the global currency, right? It is the unit of account for trading oil, for example. And of course, oil is the current lifeblood of the global economy. So, what could lead to a movement away from the dollar? And let me be clear, there has been no situation in history where once a country over-indebts itself, overextends itself militarily, they have not gone on for long-term success. That's just a fact of history, and I wish no ill will to anyone in the United States, and I wish no ill will to anyone who might suffer from a collapse of the dollar. But you have to look around and think about, wait a second, how can $21 trillion in debt, and it's expanding every year, be sustainable? Half of the United States is in poverty, and yet you look and you see this insane debt, and countries are moving away from the dollar. They are. They don't want to deal with it anymore because they know that dealing with the dollar, you have to deal with the US. And that dealing with the dollar gives undue power to the US. And again, this is not about being anti-US or any of that BS, okay? This is about looking to the situation where we might see hyper-Bitcoinization happen, because this is the real political situation that's happening now. This is not, some anti-US fantasy or any of that BS, okay? I want to make that very clear here, guys. Is that you are currently seeing a geopolitical situation where China is on the rise massively. A trade war between China and the US could actually lead to a major devaluation of the purchasing power of the US dollar. And so if we're accounting for Bitcoin and the price of dollars, well, then that's something that will definitely be a factor in that, without a doubt. Not to mention, of course, that we see the Euro-American relationship being strained under the current administration, but those are all archaic infrastructures anyway. Things like NATO is so outdated, it's not even funny. And so if we did see, for example, China starting to move away from the dollar, if we saw China, for example, trying to push, for example, to have the oil traded in the yuan, well, that is a big, big difference. Vikrant S says, China's debt is not high, lol. They gave horrible demographics. Now, look, I haven't looked at the numbers in a couple of months, but the last I saw is that China is the country with the world's largest savings. So while the United States is the most indebted country in the world, China has large stockpiles of gold, large stockpiles of US bonds, which is actually an existential risk to China and their economy being so overextended into the American economy. But they also have huge stockpiles of dollars, huge stockpiles of euros. So they've definitely, it's a very different situation. Alien Hunter says, China is a horrible country to lead the world. They know nothing about liberty. Interesting question, Alien Hunter. What is liberty? Is liberty a country that takes your taxes to use it for something that doesn't actually represent your will? Is that liberty? Or is liberty, for example, living in a country where if you consume a plant, you might go to prison? Is that liberty? So the liberty equation is a tricky one, without a doubt. So just something to think about before we criticize China too much. And yeah, China's got a lot of problems, and China deserves a lot of criticism. But at the same time, China's also leading the way on, for example, how to move the world into a renewable energy future. They're pushing that hard in China, whereas other countries are being stuck in the past. So that is an important thing to keep in mind here. And again, you have to separate the average Chinese person from the Chinese government as well. John says, are we talking politics or crypto here? To anyone who would like to separate politics away from cryptocurrency, you see one of the things we talk about the most, or at least I seem to talk about, maybe it's because of my political background, but is the intersection between politics and cryptocurrencies. Because if you think that finance is not related to politics, you got a rude awakening happening, because Bitcoin is highly, highly political. That's why China's trying to ban Bitcoin, because it's so damn political. It would lead to a revolution in their freaking country if they let people have Bitcoin and decentralized systems for long enough. And it's going to come. They can't stop the tide of history. It will overwhelm them at some point, and they'll simply have to adopt or be crushed by it. And we see this happening in other places. Why do you think all these bankers are always talking trash on Bitcoin? Why do you think you have this clown Sherman the other day in Congress calling for the ban of Bitcoin? Because it's all political. And making the case for the hyper-Bitcoinization of the world, well, that is an important part of the equation. Now, an interesting thing that happened the other day as well, Russia has been dumping US debt and buying gold instead. I bring this story up because they've been buying gold, but who has been buying Bitcoin? I have a feeling that countries like Russia are quietly acquiring stockpiles of Bitcoin. We see, for example, South Korean banks currently own about 1% of all cryptocurrency, which is massive. Big companies in the UK mostly have at least a small strategic reserve of cryptocurrencies. And if you think that governments aren't getting into cryptocurrencies yet, you're sadly mistaken. I'm sure that countries like Russia, and I'm sure the Chinese government, even though they came out against cryptocurrencies, let's put the tinfoil hat on for a second and assume that maybe China cracked down on cryptocurrency so that the government could buy it up. Random conspiracy theory for you. Maybe not, of course, but nevertheless, I guarantee that there are governments who are starting to stockpile strategic reserves of Bitcoin, and Bitcoin will become rare. It will be. I feel like right now Bitcoin is quite common. It's quite easy to find. It's quite easy to buy. But if you live in that situation where, let's say Russia has 500,000 Bitcoin and they're just sitting it in their bank as a frickin' strategic reserve, what's that going to do to the price of Bitcoin? If South Korean banks get 2 or 3% of all cryptocurrencies, the major stuff anyway, what's that going to do to the price of cryptocurrencies? That is an interesting thing. User Pike asks, I wonder how many Bitcoin Putin and Trump have. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. And Africa. Let's move on to a lighter topic here. So, Africa obviously has been put out as a big use case for cryptocurrencies. And look, Africa is a big and diverse continent with a lot of countries that are in very different economic stages and in different stages of financial access, right? So you got to keep that in mind. But there have been some key countries inside the continent that have really been getting into cryptocurrencies. We mentioned Kenya and what Bancor is trying to do there. Nigeria was so interesting when I was talking to Ray Youssef. He's the CEO over at Paxful. And the situation in Nigeria where you go to the bank, you're only allowed to take out a few dollars a day. Could you imagine that? Could you just imagine that for a moment? You go to the bank and you have, let's say you have $5,000 in your bank account. You're only allowed to take out, let's say, $20 a day. How would that affect your life? That would be massive. And that is massive for a lot of people. And so when you see that kind of a situation happening, Bitcoin suddenly becomes incredibly compelling for these people. And again, accessing international markets is a very important part of that equation. You're a businessman, you live in Nigeria, and hey, now you can start buying things from the country next door. You can start importing things from Amazon, selling them down at your local shop. All of these things become possible. There you go. Okay, on to the next bit. Now, Venezuela is probably one of the most interesting use cases for Bitcoin going, because everything else we've talked about is voluntary, right? If you live in the US or in Australia or whatever, and you want to go down and if you want to pay your bills in cryptocurrency, you can. Maybe you get a little discount for doing that, maybe not, right? You want to buy your coffee, you can do that too. But that's not compelling. That's not a have to situation. Obviously, if we saw the US dollar completely collapse in some kind of Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe situation, which I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, that would change perspectives on the utilization of Bitcoin in somewhere like the United States. Again, I hope that doesn't happen. That'd be terrible for a lot of people that I know and for a lot of people out here listening right now. But a country that absolutely may be the perfect test case for a full crypto economy is Venezuela. And their own government has failed so bad, so deeply bad, at actually trying to manage their economy that the inflation has just got to the point where it's basically worthless money at this point. You can go down and get, I don't know, say 100 million bolivars, and it's like, $100 souvenir you can take back as a big shopping bag full of money. But that's not a good situation. That's not a situation that lets people go down to the local store and buy things. In fact, the crazy thing is here is that the markets in Venezuela have been getting to a point where you don't even see a lot in the markets. And so people are using the black market. But if you want to use the black market to buy groceries, I got bad news for you. If you live in Venezuela, nobody wants your crappy money. But what people might want is Bitcoin. And so there's this raging black market going on of daily flights coming in from like Miami with medicine and food and things, and people are paying in Bitcoin, or people are using Bitcoin to buy Amazon gift cards from companies like Paxful in order to buy things that otherwise would not be available for them. And now another interesting factor is that the international aspect is very interesting, to get in things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get. But within Venezuela, just imagine this. Why the heck would you want to get bolivars if you're a Venezuelan? If you have a coffee shop, or you have you're a serviceman, you build houses or whatever it might be. Well, why would you want to accept cryptocurrency? Why would you want to accept your own local fiat money? You wouldn't. But again, this is a great situation where we can see Bitcoin stepping in, where we can see people wanting to accept cryptocurrencies because you have a mobile phone, you can be your own bank. And this is where we're going with the idea of hyperbitcoinization. Because if we live in a world where local governments, they can't really manage their economies very well. Whether you're the richest country in the world, you're not managing your economy very well. Whether you're a poor country, well, you're not managing your economy very well. Because centralized planning for economies isn't working very well. We have too much human corruption. We have printing presses making money 24 hours a day. And it's not really working. It just isn't. It just isn't. We can see the devaluation of the dollar over time. We can see hyperinflation in Zimbabwe and Venezuela. It's not working out very well. Ariel says, Venezuela using Bitcoin? I doubt it. Maybe they do not have a computer or a cell phone. Ariel, there are a lot of people who do not have computers and cell phones. Yes, this is true. 100%. There are also a lot of people who do have computers and cell phones. And look, I know people who, live in the US or here in New Zealand. They don't have computers or cell phones. It's not just a developing country thing, but actually phone ownership in developing countries is growing massively. They're leapfrogging over these infrastructure hurdles that actually the more developed economies have to move away from. They can just jump right over that. They can get that $20 phone. Or you don't even have to personally hold it yourself. You could have one phone per family. And that is powerful. Not everybody has to have a phone. Not everybody has to have the Bitcoin. You could just have one person in your family who has a phone, and now you have access to international markets. Now you don't need your local bank's permission. You don't need your government's permission. And that is why governments are cracking down on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, because it really is a fundamental threat to their whole business model. The banks, the debt, the corrupt governments, the writing's on the wall for them. The challenge we have now as a cryptocurrency community is moving forward in a way where we don't give up on cryptocurrencies. And regulation's probably one of the most double-edged swords possible when it comes to crypto, because we see some countries put out very great regulations where they say, oh yeah, use cryptocurrency for whatever you want, we're just going to take a little bit of tax, and that's pretty positive, where we see others go the opposite direction. It's going to be a tricky road to move ahead, but I'm highly encouraged about the future of cryptocurrencies. And when you realize the potential for it, and you realize where we might be heading, how can you not be excited about cryptocurrencies? But that's just me. Bitcoin forever. Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and finish the chat up there for today, but I really, really want to thank everyone who came out. I'm sorry I didn't get to answering more questions. Sometimes I get a bit away with myself, but I really, really appreciate all of you guys for coming out, talking to each other in the chat. I see the conversations going on, so that's absolutely awesome to see everyone being part of the community, talking to each other and sharing opinions, exchanging ideas. This is how we grow as a crypto community moving forward. You guys are awesome. So thank you so much for coming out and listen to a dude talk about cryptocurrencies on the internet. Long live the blockchain, and peace out till next time.